Oh, got it. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. It is absolutely a pleasure to see so many of you have honored your commitment on such nice warm temperatures. It's very tempting not to be in front of a computer. We really appreciate it. This is the second webinar that Seniors Action Quebec is organizing. Out of 6, we'll be having one every month till March, except for the month of January. So keep an eye on our Facebook and our website, and you'll be kept up to date. Most importantly, I have to thank our funders, which are the Secrétariat aux Relations avec les Québécois d'Expression Anglaise and Educalois. As you've just been asked, and you've done so, your mics are to be muted throughout the session to enable us to produce a good recording that you can use, and you should receive that in approximately 2 days. Our partners throughout Quebec will also have access to it and have the capabilities of posting it on their social media platforms, but also be able to take the information that Frances will be sharing with us today and use it in their local setting with their own local boards. Throughout the sessions, you will see on your agenda after each presentation, there's a question and answer period. We ask you, as you think of a question, please put it in the chat box. That will enable Katia to pull the questions, avoid any duplicated questions, and manages to keep us on our time schedule because we have 10 minutes for questions at each session. So that would be extremely helpful. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our presenter, a longtime friend. Our paths have crossed many times over the decades. We won't go how many. And that is Dr. Frances Ravensbergen, who has been working and consulting with the community sector in Quebec for over 40 years. She has provided board role and responsibility training to support numerous nonprofit organizations. She was a founder and active with the Center of Community Organizations from 2000 to 2021. Often, most of us may have referred to that organization as COCO. She also works at Concordia University in Applied Human Science and the School of Community and Public Affairs. And if that wasn't enough, she also collaborates as a consultant with the Secrétariat aux Relations avec les Québécois d'Expression Anglaise and supports organizational change and process with national organizations. Her passion is conducting evaluations and collaborating with organizations on their long-term viability. Now, there is not a soul here that is on the board or an executive director or senior staff member that cannot relate to this issue and challenge. Her other passion, of course, is spending time with her grandchildren. And without further ado, the show is now Frances. I'm turning it completely over to her. I know you will learn a lot, and I'm very anxious to hear what you have to say, Frances. Thank you for doing this for us.
Oh, you're very welcome, Ruth, and it's wonderful to be here with everyone. Yes, I have a passion for grandchildren, and somehow I've ended up doing this session sitting in Toronto in my daughter's house. You've got kids' artwork behind you. I've got kids' artwork in front of me. So yeah, my grandkids surround me a lot. But also my interest in effective nonprofit organizations. And I think one of the huge challenges is figuring out in each organization how to really have a successful, well-functioning board of directors. It's a science a little bit, but it's also an art. And so I'm really hoping that what I share with you today, because we don't have a back and forth in the moment that we can do, that you take what speaks to you, take what makes sense. If you need to question a little bit, go for it. You can put some in the chat line, but think about it in relation to the boards of directors that you're involved in. And yeah, and hopefully you'll be able to pull some things out of it that you can take away between the handouts and the presentation. So I'm going to go actually right away to sharing my screen. We won't be doing it the whole time. But I do want to get into the presentation. And yeah, there we go. So successful governing boards, some concepts to consider. Coming from my experience working with many, many boards over the years, and also actually a fairly critical analysis of the way the nonprofit sector is legally structured in the Western world that makes it really challenging, I think, for boards to be successful. And we'll get into that in the presentation. We've divided it into 3 blocks so that we get a little bit of a break, and also that you can get your questions in there. The first block, we're going to talk about kind of bylaws and the more legal stuff, and some of the other foundational documents that are so key. We're going to do that because I find often when there's a challenge with a board of directors, we tend to forget that we need to go back to the foundation. So we'll just remind ourselves about that. And then I thought we'd go through the journey of a board member, which we've all done from when we start to when we finish. And what are maybe some of the key elements that we need to be considering for ourselves when we go on a board, and also when we're running boards, to make sure that we have the basic elements in place for a successful experience. And the reason it's important for it to be successful for individuals and the organization is that when we want our organizations to function effectively, of course, but also when people leave our board, they take that experience on our board of directors and they take it to other boards. And too many of us have been on dysfunctional boards and take dysfunctional behavior onto other boards. So we need to, in the sector, really develop good practice that we can spread wider in the sector to have effectively functioning boards, coming from members continually knowing how to be a board member. And it's not surprising that we don't know how to be a board member, because whoever taught you how to be a board member? We never got it in high school. We didn't get it in CEGEP, for those who were around when CEGEP was there, university. So we tend to learn on the go. So important that we get these skills. Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you and throw you off. Are we supposed to be seeing your screen now?
You're seeing my
no.
overview? You're seeing my slideshow?
No.
You're not.
No, we're not. So we're not.
Well,
you're not sharing it.
Thank you for telling me that. So let me try that again. Let's close that. Share screen. I'm screen sharing now.
We're good.
We're good. Yeah.
We're good.
Okay, so that was actually a long introduction where you didn't necessarily have to see that first slide, but let me get into it. So the idea of understanding background and the journey that all members go through so that we can spread good practice of being board members more widely. After that, we'll have a little bit of a chance for some questions. Then the second block is probably the most fundamental one, which is roles and responsibilities of board members. So there's different takes on that, but there's some consensus in the literature on what those responsibilities are. We'll run through that, and there'll probably be lots of questioning about that, because that's an area that is often still quite gray. And then in the third block, I've got a couple of what I'm calling other considerations to talk about, and we can throw in questions that people haven't had a chance to bring up yet, and a little summary, and we'll finish up by noon. And you'll see here in the corner that I have a group of people who are creating something. They're cooking something up. And what I would like you to think about today is the board of directors that you're cooking up. What are the ingredients that you need for a good board of directors? And maybe hang on to this image as we go through it and see if you can pull some ideas from what I'm saying, either for your particular board or for a board in general. So that's what we'll go through. Starting off, first little section, bylaws and other foundational documents. You've got here a series of bowls. And what those bowls represent is what has to hold the cooking of a good board of directors. What you're making with the board of directors needs to be contained within these major documents. And of course, the law is the table underneath it. The Civil Code of Quebec, incorporated under the third party of the law in the 1800s, which is why it can be so challenging, under as a subsection to the Corporations Act. So the way that nonprofits are legally structured can certainly be challenging in terms of the roles and responsibilities between board and staff. But that's the table that everything sits on, and we need to be following the law. Within that, the biggest bowl that holds our responsibilities as a board are our incorporation papers. And I'm wondering if everybody even has seen their incorporation papers or knows what it says, because in that paper, it says what your fundamental purpose is. And that's really important that we're aware of that and that we stay within that. And if it was badly written because it was too narrow for what we're doing, it means we have to go one level lower, which is the table, and deal with the government to change the incorporation. And if you're a charitable organization, that becomes challenging. But that's what holds the responsibilities of the board. So what are in your incorporation papers? And I'm just going to give you one quick example. I was working with an organization a while ago, and they managed to buy a building, which is super exciting. Building cost 1.2 million. I said, go back and look at your incorporation papers. Incorporated in 1974. And what do the papers say? They can only hold assets up to $1 million. $1 million was a lot of money in the 70s. It's not as much now. So they are having to go back to the government to change their incorporation papers. So that's what holds the foundation of the organization. And then of course, the bylaws. The bylaws are also created by the organization, and every board member, and I know you folks know this, but we've got to know our bylaws and we've got to follow our bylaws. It talks about who the members are. It talks about what the board is composed of. It talks about how big decision-making gets made. It talks about who has things like some financial authorities. And it's important that we're always going back to that bowl if we have a question and saying, what do the bylaws say about the work of our board? It'll stop us from getting into trouble, particularly at our annual general meeting, because it should be in your bylaws how your annual general meeting runs. So there's bylaws that guide us as a board of directors, and then there's policies. And I always laugh when I worked for a large organization years ago that I was hauled into the executive director's office. I was running a branch and I was told I had broken a policy. And I was like, which policy is that? Where is it? It wasn't written down. It was in my boss's mind that that was what made sense to do. And often we work like that, but it's important that we have policies in place. And as a board, that we make sure that those policies are being followed. And we're going to talk more about policies a little bit later. And often it's human resource policies, but there's others that organizations have also. And then the smaller bowl is procedures. So what are the procedures, procedural documents that we have in the organization? And what I love is, because every organization is so different, the bowls are always quite different. The policies are different. The procedures often aren't written down. And that's where we can start getting into trouble a little bit. Not that we have to be writing everything down, but if we have clarity and talk about how we implement things, then it becomes really, really helpful. So a procedure might be how it works when it might be under policy, but it might be policies and procedures are often together. When there's a complaint, how does a member or how does a staff person go through making a complaint? Can we write that down in a procedural kind of way? What are the steps that people need to follow? And having these foundational documents in place is super, super helpful for saving us from getting into problems at all kinds of levels. So that's the very first step that we need to be looking at. What are those documents, and are we aware of them? Or do we need to be creating them, or do we need to be adapting them a little bit? incorporation goes to the government, bylaws, it goes to the annual general meeting, policies get decided at the board, procedures often get decided by the staff because it's things like registration procedures or some safety procedures, which might come to the board also. That's the gray line of where's the board and where's the staff, depending on the culture of the organization. So let me talk now a little bit about what I'm going to call the journey of a board member. And we've all been through this. Maybe you've only done it as an executive director and looked at the road that a board member goes on, but I think most of us have probably actually been on this road. And the first thing that happens is recruitment. Somehow we get onto that board of directors. And the question I have for people is to think about, how conscious is that process of recruitment? Are we really thinking about who it is that we should have on the board, and not in just individuals? He's a good guy, she's amazing, but really thinking about it in terms of, does this person represent or understand the big picture of the issue that we're working on, or are they very knowledgeable within a certain area of the kind of work that we're doing? What is it that they can bring to the board of directors? And I don't think all of us on our boards need to be doing this, but I think many of us need to more consciously be working on recruitment in a very precise kind of way. As we're thinking about the annual general meeting and saying to current board members, are you planning on staying? Are you planning on leaving? Having a discussion also about who are the kinds of people that we need to get onto our board. And then we're going to look for those people, as opposed to my dear friend Sue, who loves going to meetings with me. Because Sue might be wonderful to come, but is that necessarily appropriate? And then what's the composition of the kinds of people from, I'm thinking, members, do we have representation? Do we need to look at ages? And I know a lot of you are in senior organizations. I still think we need to look at ages. Do we have the younger seniors, middle-aged seniors? Really hard for the older seniors to be involved sometimes, but there's people who are certainly very active still and can really bring that voice of the needs of older seniors. So ages we need to think about. We need to think about ethnicities. We need to think sometimes about language, ability, disability, different parts of the neighborhood. What is it that we need on our board, and can we make that conscious? And I'm going to throw it a little challenge that people might not agree with, but I'm not convinced that we have to go out and get a lawyer and a notary on our board of directors. I want a lawyer and a notary in my back pocket that I can call, but I'm not sure that I absolutely need them on the board. I'd like to focus on my programming content and call in my other professionals as I need them. But you can disagree with me, and we can look at that a bit more. And then numbers. The last thing I want to say about recruitment is numbers. I can remember, and I think many of you can, when boards were, they were hitting 30 people, 25, 30 people. They came down to about 15. We're now seeing boards that are often 7 to 9 people, as low as 5. Some people say that's not good. I think it's better to make sure for composition that we have the quality that we need, rather than people filling chairs, and that we have the representation that we need from the different sectors that our organization is involved in. We do need to make sure we have enough people, and so having 5 might be a little small. In some, if you're incorporated federally, I believe 3 is legal. Not sure that's a great idea unless you're starting up. And of course, if you're going to change the number of people on your board, you've got to make sure that you go back and change your bylaws. You've got to follow what your bylaws say, because number of board members is part of the bylaws. So we do some recruitment. We orient people. I mean, hopefully we orient them a bit before they get on the board so that they know what's expected of them in terms of their responsibilities beyond board meetings, if there are some responsibilities. And once they're on the board, I'd really like to suggest and encourage people to think about the idea of doing some having some kind of a board manual or some kind of a document that everyone has. It's got the foundational documents in it, copy of the incorporation papers. That way you won't lose them because everybody's got a copy. Copy of the bylaws, copies of policies, minutes from the last bunch of meetings, or an organogram of the staff, maybe a list of partners. And an increasingly important one I find is a list of acronyms. What does SRQEA actually mean? And they're funding this series. And so it's pretty important that people on the board of Seniors Action Quebec know what SRQEA means. The Secrétariat des Relations des Québécoises de l'Expression Anglaise. So having an acronym list and knowing how the funding works generally. All of that is really, really good orientation material to have. I like to put it in a manual when I'm working with boards so that they've got it all together and it can get updated recently. It's got the board list in it. It's got staff contacts. It's got whatever else you think needs to be in there. The strat plan, a little bit around, mission stuff, that sort of thing. And then, every year, every 2 years, do a little bit of orientation or slip it into professional development. Did you know that board members have a right to professional development? And so maybe there's not a lot of money in the organization, but there's sessions like this that are for free. There's lots of stuff on the internet. There's articles we can send people. There's books we can encourage them to read. But if we can, building a little bit of money into the budget so that the board can actually talk about what does it need. And I'm going to talk later about what are some of the basic needs that I've seen boards of directors needing. So from professional development, we've got a year, we've got 2 years. Sometimes we're moving away from 1-year mandates. We're seeing 2-year mandates. We're seeing 3-year mandates on boards. We're seeing, and this is really good practice, as we know, rotating mandates. So I'm on for 2 years. You start a year later than me. So there's 1 year that we overlap. And that way, we've got continuity on our board instead of new people coming in all the time. And then we can start looking at what I call evaluation. And I know a lot of people say, oh, you can't do evaluation of volunteers. Well, call it evaluation of general functioning. But the idea is that we're looking at how are we functioning as a board? Can we have a little bit of a discussion about how our board is working? And I've got some tools in the handout package that I gave you, and there's good stuff on the internet that talks about evaluation. Not Francis, how are you doing on the board necessarily, but how are our committees working? How do we like our board meetings? Are there things we maybe want to change? And are there things we want to pat ourselves on the back for that we do as good practice as a board? And so we want to remember those and keep doing them. And that's something that I think we do very rarely because it takes time and energy, and we're already pretty busy, but it can really help with functioning in the long run. If once in a while we just stop and sit back, even for half an hour, and talk about how are we working here as a group and what could we do differently? And then the last part we get to is the end of our mandate. And I'm not saying the end of term, because the end of term, you can get reelected. And here's an interesting one. Increasingly, we're seeing in the sector that there's a limit to terms in the bylaws. And the reason we put a limit to terms is board turnover is healthy. Not super board turnover all the time, but saying to people, you can sit on the board for 2 years for 3 terms. That's 6 years. After that, give your space to someone else. You can come back in 2 years because you've got valuable skills. You can go be a program volunteer. You can do other things. But the idea is if we always keep the same people sitting on the board, we're not generating new ideas. We're not always bringing in different kinds of skills. And it's good, as we know with executive directors, when executive directors switch, it's a different skill set that comes in. And that's good. That's refreshing. And so if we can do that in a way that we keep the old, keep the good, but allow new people to come in, I think that's something to think about. And I know not all groups agree with that. And some groups say to me, but if I leave, and I've had this, if I leave, there's no one to replace me. And my response to that is, that's a problem. And that's not my problem as an individual leaving. That's the organizational's challenge, that we need to go back to the beginning and we need to work on recruitment. So the last bit I'll say about that is, and I think a lot of seniors organizations are good at this, but acknowledgement. Let's figure out how we acknowledge people's contributions. Being a volunteer on a board is a huge responsibility. As many of us know, it hasn't always been easy to do. We go through boards that struggle, and we're not even getting paid to do this. I mean, we believe in it with our heart, but how can we then thank people for their contribution? And that's different for everyone to do, but it's important to think about. So that's the little section on the journey of a board member. And I'm just going to stop sharing right now. And we've got some time for questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Frances. And I saw that there were a couple of questions that went in, so I'm going to turn it over to Katia, and she will be asking you. And if anybody else has questions, please get it in the chat box now pertaining to what Frances just presented. Thank you.
Hey, Frances. So I think I'll start with the second question, because I think that will give some context. Would it be possible to get clarification of the difference between bylaws and policies?
Oh, yeah, good question. Yeah. So bylaws are mandated by the government. You have to have bylaws to be incorporated as a nonprofit. And in those bylaws has to be things like your head office, what's the name of your organization, how your annual general meeting runs, numbers on the board of directors, how the board of directors gets voted on, if you have an executive committee, how that functions. Those kinds of questions get into the bylaws, and it's required by the government. And I will show this book later, and I think it's in the back of the handout package also. Votre association covers the information for provincial incorporation. I mean, that's a question. Do you know if you're incorporated provincially or federally? Because the laws are different. And there's information for federal. So that's bylaws, has to go to the government. Policies are created solely within the organization. And I know lots of us go and get other organizations' policies and adapt them, and that's fine. But we're not regulated specifically by government within policies. So the board manual, some people end up calling it a policy. We often have an HR policy. We'll look at more of those. We sometimes have a financial policy in place, and that's the organization internally, and that's the board that approves the policy, often part of developing it also, or fully developing it. And that's the board's responsibility to make sure there are policies. So very different kind of documents.
Interesting. So just to piggyback on the first question, the next question is there a draft of bylaws and policies that people can start with?
Yeah, go to the book from the government. The bylaws, that, you know, it says the composition, you know, can be no less than this and no more than that. An AGM has to be held within 6 months of the end of your year. I think that it's interesting to sometimes look at policies of or bylaws of similar organizations, but really think about it for your organization. What makes sense for your organization in terms of having in the details of the bylaws. So how you do your elections, you have to have an annual general meeting. How you do them, secret vote, open vote, can be a little bit different. And then policies are more challenging in terms of examples and where you go. My suggestion always is go to organizations you know that are willing to share their policies, but don't take them the way they are. Really work with them and adapt them for your needs, and do some internet search also around good policies.
Okay, sorry, my phone just buzzed and just scared me. Okay, there's a couple of questions that came in, and they kind of relate to the first two questions. Someone asked, when you say that it has to be filed with the government, which body of the government does it have to be filed with?
Okay, so so again, provincial, federal, when you incorporate, your bylaws have to be filed with the, why am I blanking on it? Office, I'm sorry, I'm completely blanking. Look up incorporate, like if you look up Quebec incorporation, it'll tell you where you have to go. It's the
The registre des entreprises, is that the one?
it could be that. Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
Registre des entreprises, and we've got someone out there, Jennifer, I see, is helping out.
Yeah,
Yes, Registre des entreprises, that you file them, and they have to accept them. I mean, they could be they nom. So that's why you need to sort of check the book to make sure that they're legal. And it doesn't hurt to have a few other people check your bylaws before you actually approve them, because what's helpful is getting some feedback from people. And this is a service I know that Coco has certainly offered in the past, that they say, yeah, it sounds like if you do this, it contradicts this. So is it clear enough what you're saying? Because once your bylaws are filed, and to change them, you need to go to take the changes to the annual meeting or to a special meeting to adapt them. So let's not change bylaws all the time. In fact, what I recommend organizations do is, if you need to make some changes to your bylaws and they seem to be minor, start making a list and wait a year or two until you've got something substantial, and then take it to your membership.
Okay, next question is again on bylaws. So it's a pronged question. So the first part is, when the bylaws are changed and voted on at the AGM, and at what time must we seek legal assistance when the bylaws have been changed many times and noted on the front page? Or is this step necessary at any time once the incorporation papers have been accepted?
Okay, I don't know if this answers the question. So your incorporation papers are bigger and more important than your bylaws. They were accepted first with your draft first bylaws whenever you were incorporated. I did hear saying putting the date of your updated bylaws. What a great idea. On the cover of your bylaws, last updated, what AGM it was updated at, is super important to do. Now, I don't know if that's covering the question, Katie, or...
I think so, yeah, because the first part of the question is basically, from the way I'm reading it, and if the person asks the question, maybe you can clarify in the chat, but basically it's if you're changing and voting on changes to your bylaws, what do you need to seek legal assistance, and at what time do you need to seek legal assistance?
You don't need to seek legal assistance. You need to make sure you're within the law. And so, referring to the book is super helpful. Yes, and again, some of you may be lawyers, and I don't want to offend you at all, but I don't want bylaws to end up being super legal language. I want my board members to be able to read them. So sometimes lawyers can be super helpful, as people who have worked a lot in the sector, other EDs, to help us make sure that they're clear, that they're not contradicting each other, that all the elements are covered. And then we send them in.
Okay, so I got two more questions. The next one is the role of the board itself to put into place the suggestions that Francis have made? Or does the ED play a role in how the board is functioning and implementing these suggestions?
Well, and that's, we'll get into it in the roles of responsibilities, but obviously the board has this overall responsibility to make sure that the organization is functioning within the legal framework. The ED also has a responsibility. And so there's a real partnership there in terms of making sure that all of these elements are in place. And I say this knowing full well that in lots of organizations, we're a little sketchy on some of this stuff. That's okay. We go through those phases, but can we kind of clean it up a little bit and get clearer on it? And if we're a board member, we can bring it to a board meeting with the ED. And if we're an ED, we can bring it to the board and say, let's just go through this and make sure we've cleared it up. In fact, in a lot of instances, and I think sometimes in board orientation, this is helpful to do, or board training, we take a session and we go through the bylaws. People say, yeah, I've read them. No, like, let's just take 20 minutes and go through them again and see if there are changes that we need. And that way it's a good partnership between the ED and the board of directors.
Okay, maybe I froze. Sorry, I froze. My bad. So I'll ask I'm going to ask the last question is, Francis, if you could please describe the difference between policy and procedure, because I think that's
yeah, okay,
that's a good segue.
Thank you. Yes, and we will get into it more. But policy are the big lines of what we say needs to happen. Procedure is the steps that it takes to make it happen. So the classic example, let me take one that's a little different. I won't take human resources management. Let me take the example of fees, and if we have subsidized fees for people on low income. Policy says we want everyone to participate in this organization. People who have low income need to show proof of income, and it might be welfare, that they only have welfare or old age assistance, or whatever the documents are that we need. And the policy might also say, and we really respect people, we respect everyone, and we treat them well. Some big lines like that, right? Procedure says, we talk about how do we publicize the fact that the fees, that we have subsidized fees. We talk about how do people apply for it. We talk about who has access to that information of who's living on low limited income, who has, how do we document that to actually have confidentiality in place. So policy, big lines about what is it we believe and what we're going to do. Procedure is how are we going to do it? And I know we mix the two up. I've got a little bit of information in the handout package about that, and there's some good sources on the web also to make sure we differentiate that a little bit.
Thanks. I think we're good question-wise.
Thank you very much for your questions, everyone. And bear in mind that we still have a way to go, so some other questions may come up as we proceed. And if you think of something that you forgot to ask during this session, you can pop it in during the next. So we're going to move right along. We're staying quite close to our timing. And we're going to go with the roles and responsibilities of the board of directors. And Frances will share her screen. And just a reminder, if somebody's
Thank you.
late,
And let me
please turn off your cameras. Go ahead, Frances.
Thanks, Ruth. And let me just say, if I'm talking a little too fast, people should send a note in, and Ruth or Katie will do something to tell me to slow down. I find it super challenging when I can't be with people and actually exchanging in the moment. So sorry if it throws things off a little bit that way. So let's talk about roles and responsibilities, going back to my PowerPoint. And okay. Different people formulate in slightly different ways what the roles and responsibilities of a board member are. I'm taking this from the work of Carver, but it's been expanded on a little bit, and it integrates the work of some other people. Generally, I think that there are 4 big roles that board members have as a responsibility. The very first one is the big picture direction for the organization. It's often called the vision. It's like, where are we going? And the board needs to hold that. I'm going to also argue that staff hold that a lot, and the ED holds that a lot, but the board should be having that wider vision, idea, even clarity of where it is the organization is going and what it's supposed to be doing. And I'll go into this in more detail in a minute. Creating policy. overall a responsibility of the board. Staff members may help with developing policy, but the actual saying this is going to be a policy needs to be voted on at the board level, not procedures, but policy. This is because this is the beliefs of the organization that we're putting into action. Monitoring performance at a couple of levels of the organization and how it's functioning, of our responsibilities, and of the executive director. In some cases, boards actually monitor the performance of staff beyond the executive director, but in many cases, it's the executive director they're responsible for, and the executive director is responsible for monitoring performance for other employees. And the last one, which I had mentioned already, is board development. So the board is responsible for its own development and needs to make sure that it works on having the skills that it needs to do the job that it needs to do. And I do want to just note on your handout package on page 13 to 15, there is more information about creating policy, because I can hear that's one that's interesting to people, and we might come back to that at the very end. And on page 3 of the handout package, my note says, let me double check. Yes, page 3 of the handout package goes into these 4 elements in a little bit more detail, pulling more on the Carver model. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more from my experience. So the first one, roles and responsibilities of the board, big picture direction for the organization. So the board needs to approve mission, values, if there's a vision for the organization. Doesn't mean that the board holds it alone, but the board needs to know that, own that, and have been part of developing those bits of information. The big picture also making sure that it's aligned with the incorporation objectives, so that we're not going off on a tangent. And I'll tell you right now, from some departments in mostly the provincial government, there's a lot of money being sent to organizations, and it gets very difficult to stay within the incorporation objectives because it's called mission drift, right? We've seen it. There's money, we say we need money, we take that money is not there to do what we really need to be doing in our community, but it's money and we need to keep the doors open. And then we start doing other things that aren't fully aligned with what we're supposed to be doing. So if we're working with seniors and we're supposed to be working with isolation, and we start doing exercise and fitness classes, which is part of dealing with isolation, but it's not part of our mandate, and the city is the one who's doing that a lot more. We start running into some challenges of how we frame that work, and is it really aligned with our incorporation? And that's the place for the board to have that really good discussion about funding sources, about how closely it aligns to what we need to be doing. And if it doesn't fully, do we say no? And I know that's a big no-no for organizations, but I actually think sometimes we need to say no to funding. Or can we find ways to really work with the funder and adjust it so that it fits well? And certainly a part of looking at the long-term direction is the goals and the strategies to live the mission. And that's the strategic plan. And more organizations have, if not strategic plans, at least strategic directions in place. And that's an important role for the board to be part of that, to be part of, not alone, staff are part of it, partners are part of it, members can be part of it. I've worked with groups where funders actually sit in the room and help us look at that. And I think there's a role to do that for them to be there at times. So the board, though, has the responsibility to make sure that those things are in place. So we've got some mission, we've got some values, we're lined up within those bowls that we're cooking our board of directors in, and we've got some long-term strategies or a strategic plan in place. And the reason that's important is because otherwise we're going to be like Alice in Wonderland when she says, you know, where should I go from here? And the cat says, well, it depends where you want to go. And if we say as an organization, we don't care where we go, then we can take any path at all, and we will get somewhere, but we won't respond to the needs of our community. And so the board has to really be thinking about what are those needs and how can we respond to it, not in the minute detail, we all know that, but in the big picture of the direction of the organization. So that's one role for the board. And I think this is one of the challenges with the Incorporations Act, under the fact that it's under the Incorporations Act for businesses. Staff really know what's going on the ground. And so board members really need to know what's going on enough in the organization, but also in that community that you're serving, so that we can make that contribution to the future, and that it's a partnership with board and staff to come to a consensus. And I know that's an art, not a science, to find that balance between board and staff engagement in those questions. But it is a responsibility of the board to make sure that the big picture items for the organization are clear and there's some consensus around them. So why will sorry, it won't move forward. Here we go. Create policy. Okay, so policies, big ticket items, not in the bylaws, but where we need clarity. Human resources, unless you've got two, even if you've got 2 employees, you really should have a human resources policy. I know it sounds really detailed, but this is the area we run into so many problems in. But talking about how we hire people, how does vacation work, just getting on paper how many days off people have. Yes, we have to follow government regulations, but there's more details than that. Sometimes there's things around dress code, around hours of work. Certainly now with the phase we're in with COVID, like how much working from home is accepted. Often in human resources policy, we talk about how we represent the organization, our profile on social media. I mean, there's so many things that can go into that. And so even if it's very small, I really think it's good to have that stuff written down, even if there's a very small staff team in place. And it can be changed fairly easily. It goes to the board. We change policy at the board level. And so it's not like we have to hold some kind of special meeting or go back to the government for that. So having that kind of policy in place is helpful. Often a financial policy is helpful. And the policy talks about kind of who has access to what kind of information, how money flows. You know, it might be in the bylaws. Again, that's where there's some confusion. What does the treasurer, the role of the treasurer, a little bit, what does staff do? Financial policy might say, you know, there's only these people that have access to the codes involving the banking information. Our policy, I find this fascinating, how we pay people. I'm being asked more and more to simply send my bank information, and everything is sent to me through my bank account. And that's as a consultant. And so there's something about, do you have a contract with your consultant so it's really clear? These are all can be elements of your financial policy. And then really important, it's being emphasized a lot within the provincial government now, harassment policy. How do we deal with harassment? What is harassment? And there's lots on the website of, I'm sorry, I keep blanking this morning. Not CNET, the old employee site.
CNSST.
Norm de travail.
Yeah.
Thank you. CNSST. Yes. Yeah. And conflict. And this is something when I was at COCO that we were really encouraging. If there's a conflict, who do you go to? And, you know, kind of the standard idea of when there's a conflict, that the first thing we do is, if possible, we ask people to try to figure it out among themselves. If it's not possible, you pull someone in, you take it one level up. What's the top level it goes to, if it's between board and a staff person, board and an ED, or between staff and staff, or with volunteers. Like, there's so many levels of conflict that we could potentially have. How do we, what's the system? And then we get people to apply the policy, make sure they know the policy, and then apply it to deal with the conflict. And then board functioning, which might be a policy or might be a manual. So differences, you know, policy, the board has to go through and approve as a stated policy. We often have, when we're bigger, we have a policy book. A manual is something that tends to be a lot more, it's a smaller bowl. We change it a lot more quickly. It floats around a lot more. Elements of it change. It might not even be approved by the board. The staff might have a couple of manuals in place also. So these, I think, are some of the key policies. And then people say to me, oh my goodness, this is like a lot of paperwork happening here. And we're a nice grassroots organization. We want policies in place to avoid getting into trouble. And so if we've gotten into trouble with something, maybe that's the time to start writing policy around it. And one of the ones I've seen in a few places, and I realize it's not on my list, is public communications. What is our communications policy? Who speaks on behalf of the organization? That kind of thing can go in that. But additional policies, you see the list there. I mean, investment. If you have assets to invest, I'm on a board of directors of a foundation, slightly different than a nonprofit. We obviously have more investments. We have a very, very clear policy about what type of bank we actually have to use. And we have rules that we have to make sure we follow in terms of investments. So that's something to look at. Plain language might surprise you, but for a lot of organizations, we need to look at plain language policy. We need to make sure we're working at a grade 6 level of writing so that our members can understand what's going on. And we need, when we put out publicity, we need to make sure that it's written in a way that people can actually follow it. Volunteer policy is one a lot of organizations have, and that's really helpful for giving clarity to volunteers about their roles, administratively, how, and that's getting into the procedures bit, but you have to track your hours would be a policy. And then the system for tracking hours. Working with students, and folks might on the chat line want to suggest other kinds of policies also that you feel need to be in place. So creating policy, and it's not necessarily done alone, can be done with the staff, but creating policy is a board responsibility, and the board needs to approve policies. And then when they change, the board needs to approve them. And then the challenge is when we have a policy, we actually have to follow it, which is why we need it in our board manual, and staff need to be oriented towards it also. So that's 2 of the key areas. Another area for the board of directors in terms of roles and responsibilities is monitoring performance. And I think we all know this one of the executive director. It's, unless your bylaws state it differently, the executive director is hired by the board of directors. Could be a subcommittee, but it's the board that is hiring the executive director. And I wrote support and evaluate. It can be supervised depending on the role within the organization. I find it really interesting that in a lot of our organizations, I think we leave our executive directors a little bit high and dry. We have our board meetings. We don't have either the chair or someone else nominated who can be there for the executive director to take things to that aren't quite ready for a board discussion item. I worked once with a national organization, and I loved watching the way the executive director would show up at the chair's house right around supper time, maybe once a week. They had a very good relationship, and over a glass of wine, they would actually try to work out what some of the problems were, because they were going through a lot of changes. And the chair was there to support the executive director, but also to make sure decisions aren't being made with the 2 of them, but the things get taken to the board in the way that a board can work with them. Evaluation of the executive director is a responsibility of the board of directors. And I know people don't like doing it, but employees have a right to be evaluated. And so figuring out a system with the executive director is important to do. I'm going to argue it doesn't have to be every year, but some kind of regular sit down, talking about how it's going, maybe working with some kind of a grid. There's really interesting like 360 evaluation where you get all kinds of people involved in it, involving the executive director in themselves commenting on how they think things are going and what maybe needs to change or where they need some professional development. But we need to support our employees. And so finding ways to do that is important, and every organization is different, but it is a responsibility to monitor that performance. There's also a responsibility to monitor organizational effectiveness. So yes, board, let's ask to do a review of the annual plan, do a review of the strategic plan. And it's not to say we're failing on this, we're failing on this, we're failing on this. It's like, how well have we done with this strategic goal, and what's blocking us? And is it still valid? Do we need to shift things a little bit? Or what can we put in place in the coming year to move more fully towards what we need to be doing? So, but somewhere there's a role for the board in terms of saying, this is what we said we were going to be doing, lovingly asking, and how are we doing? And playing its role in terms of moving that forward. And then the third role of monitoring performance is ensuring the legal requirements are respected. And so this is not something the board needs to sit on all the time, but there is a check to do of, are corporate records being kept? Is the financial information being kept for, I think it's like a 5 or 7 year period? Are we doing the GST, PST, any tax responsibilities that we have? Are we dealing with employees properly in terms of taking off the amount of taxes or benefits that we should be taking off? Are we meeting the requirements of our charitable number? And it doesn't mean I'm going to suggest that the entire board jumps on that and starts looking at that. The board has the bigger vision, but checking to make sure, ensuring that those are done. So doing a check-in, and it could be the executive committee, occasionally working with the executive director around that. So those are areas for monitoring performance. And then the last area, broad area that I'd like to share with you for board responsibility is board development. And this is one that I rarely see boards doing, and boards I've been involved in, often we don't do it very well, but it's working on our own development. So thinking about how is governance working, the jobs that we've got. So more and more job design, more and more we're seeing co-chairs because people don't want to take chairing on alone. So, do we need to do that? I'd like to learn to chair, but, or I'd like to learn to be the secretary. Never done it, scares me. Can I work with you on it? Can we do a handover thing over a year where I learn those skills? That's important. Attendance, often a huge issue at boards. It's sort of the elephant in the room, the people who don't attend. We need to talk about that. We need to figure out what's going on with that, and if it makes sense for that person to be on the board, or if our board needs to work in a different kind of way. Board discipline. I mean, the one I love with that is we've got the people who talk all the time, and then we got the people who rarely talk. And how do we bring those two together so that we hear from everyone in appropriate ways? And sometimes discipline is other things also, people taking information that shouldn't be leaving the board meeting and has gone out, all those kinds of things. We have to work on our own development. Board development is things like attending sessions such as this one. I mean, hats off to everyone who's here, because it takes time and energy, and it's a way of developing ourselves and helping us in terms of our own board. And then the last idea I want to leave with you around board development is just my thoughts in the last number of years, having worked with a lot of organizations. What are some of the trainings? I mean, you might be able to think of some training things that make sense for your board. But two of the things that I find are really interesting. One is communications training, and it's literally how to talk about the organization. At COCO, there was a wonderful training that we did, and it was kind of like either it was cake or ice cream, since we liked our sweets at COCO. And it was about, what's fundamental that you have to say about the organization, the elevator speech about what we do and how we do it and who we do it with, basically your mission. And then there's the sweet, the icing on the cake, or the extra ice cream that we put on the cone, which is, who are we talking to and what will interest them? And so how can we say that? And do we need 2 or 3 extra scoops of ice cream? And really getting to understand how to share information about the organization can be so helpful. So that might be an interesting training or some kind of communications training for people to consider. And another one I'm going to suggest is, if you don't know it, funding basics. Everyone should know how to read your auditor's report. And I know people say, I trust the treasurer and I trust the staff. Of course we trust them, or we would be changing them, but we still need to know how to read those kinds of statements. And if we get, for instance, quarterly statements or whatever, we need to know how to read those and understand them. And often we need a little bit of training on it. And I'm realizing I wrote funding basics, that's more finances. So there's different parts to funding. That's the financial part. The other part is, and I love asking, and I'll leave it at this, I love asking this question to people: who funds the organization? And do we actually know who the funders are of the organization of whose board we're on? And do we know who the biggest funder is? And do we know who the biggest 3 or 4 funders are? And that's really important information as a board member to know if we're really going to understand how this organization works. So I'm going to leave it at that and throw it back to you, Ruth.
Thank you very much, Francis. This was marvelous. Now we're right on time. You're very good at this. We have a 10-minute break, so stretch, make a pit stop. We get a cup of tea, water. And I would suggest, if you have a question and you have not put it in the chat box, now's a good opportunity for you to do so, because when we come back, Katya will be going to questions to Francis on the subjects that you just heard about. And then we'll move right into the presentation number 3. So I'm going to ask you all to come back in 10 minutes. So that will be at 10:45. Is that right? Yes.
Yes, it is 10:45.
So we'll see you back in a few minutes. Don't shut down. Just move away. Keep your cameras closed. Now we're going to go to Katya, who's going to ask Francis questions on the session that she just presented. So we have 15 minutes for that till 11 o'clock.
Hi again. Francis, are you there?
I am.
Okay, hi. I have it in speaker, so I can't see everyone in speaker view. So one question that came up is, should you have guidelines for things like petty cash, pocket expenses? That's not the word. Expenses, pocket money, I guess. Should you have guidelines for things like that?
Out of pocket expenses.
Thank you.
And my answer is yes. And you know what an organization, it's a youth organization, said to me recently? We don't deal with money. Like, we don't deal with cash anymore. And I was like, oh, right. So you actually need a policy on bank transfers, credit card use, limits that people have on that, who has access. I think it's really good, especially with money, to be clear, because none of us wants to be accused wrongfully of taking money, and when we didn't do it. And so having real clarity around that is helpful. Most organizations, as with many policies, seem to get at it when there's a problem. And I mean, it's not the ideal way for policy development, especially not the human resource one. Please get one in place. But for a lot of, like, some of the smaller policy stuff, it's like, ooh, we really don't have clarity. It's causing a little bit of friction. Let's look at this from a positive way and develop a policy around it while we try to solve this problem that we've gotten ourselves into. The other thing to do is to check with other organizations that are similar to yours. I think a lot of EDs are open to sharing, and what are the policies they have? And that might be a good place to start.
Okay, in the same spirit, I guess, there was a question that came up of, should board members be compensated?
Board members cannot be compensated, not salaried, right? If we have these out-of-pocket expenses because we're traveling on behalf of the organization, Or I was going to say, if we have to take a funder out for a meal, every funder I've tried to pay for a meal for will not let me. They pay because they don't want it to be seen as a bribe. That's their policy. So if it's out expenses related to board work, and you might want to have a policy on that, travel expense, is it the same as what staff have? Is it, I'm not sure what else it would be, because I'm thinking, some expenses might be related to, and I'm going to get into this in a minute, the difference between being a board member and a program volunteer. And so if I'm running a program and I need to go buy the Halloween decorations, that's different than a board member. And there needs to be a policy, or, I need to know what the limits to spending are and how I get reimbursed. So all of that is, very clear to have. Sorry, I felt like I was digressing into Halloween.
Oh, good. It's Halloween. You're allowed. A super interesting question came up that got a bit of conversation going. So the question is I can't speak in English, in an all volunteer small grassroots organization, do they need an ED, or is having a president and a VP, or a president and or a president and VP, well, you wouldn't have a VP without a president, is that enough?
So if we don't have staff in our organization, our board plays an additional role. And that role is the actual day-to-day management of the organization. If we don't have any staff to do it, and there's lots of us doing that, right? We're running all of the activities at the same time, and we need to have clarity about that. And some of us have, maybe 2 or 3 staff people, like programmy type people that are all at the same level, but there's no ED. We need clarity. So we need clarity about how does that staff team connect to the board? And it might be that one of the staff people is designated as a board liaison person. And so they're the ones that bring the information to the board and do the exchange. The important one is, and I'm probably going to say this a few times in the next section, is when there's doubt, seek clarity, ask the question so that we can figure out what needs to be put in place.
Okay, then the next question is, which I think is actually really interesting. It's a good question to ask. At an AGM, who moves, seconds, and votes on minutes? For example, approval of agenda, minutes, anything really. What's the procedure?
Members, and that's why you need to know who your members are. And that's why, really ideally at the AGM, when people come into the room, we have a membership list and we tick off who they are, because we don't always know that, and it's not always clear, and we don't always, and it should be in the bylaws what it takes to be a member. Do you have to pay $5 a year, or do you just have to, sign a sheet? You can do it the day of the AGM that you believe in the objectives of the organization. Every organization's different depending on its culture. Some organizations, if you want to be a member, you have to get approved previously by the board of directors. Your names go to the board of directors and you have to be approved. And I have heard of cases where people have been refused and there was nothing in policy about what do you do then? And that caused quite a stir for someone who was refused as a member to the organization. So it's members who come to the AGM. It's members who make those. As a member, I can be the treasurer. I can make the motion also. The one I always laugh at is when we get to the minutes of last year's meeting, and I wasn't there, but I think they're accurate. And I passed the motion. I wasn't there. I'm not allowed to do that. Those are a little bit more minor things, but if you just think logically through it, those are the things that we need to consider. If I wasn't part of it, I can't actually approve that.
Okay, and I guess this is the last question. Do we have? Maybe no. Yeah. What are your views on staggered boards to ensure continuity?
Yeah, I actually think it's really, really great. I've seen it working well. I haven't seen it working perfectly because we start off the first year, we do it with beautiful staggering. And then, somebody leaves early and things go on. But what it does is it brings in some new blood. The older people who have been around longer can orient that person a little bit more, and slowly those roles can shift from the people who are going to be leaving to the people who are a little bit newer as they get more comfortable. I really get it when people say, get on a board, and they say, I am just so confused. I don't know what to say or what to do, especially when there's been no orientation. And so having people slowly ease into it is very helpful. That's why I also think that 2 or 3 year terms is not a bad idea. I'm not convinced that 1 year terms are the answer. You're just getting to know what you're supposed to be doing, and technically you could be off the board.
Okay. And then one more question is, what is the usual amount for board membership? Is there an average?
So there is a minimum, and I don't quote me on this. I think federally you can go as low as 3. And I think provincially it has to be 5 after your incorporation, but I'm not absolutely sure about that. You determine what it is. And then that's what gets sent to the government. What you need to think about is, what kind of representation do you need on your board, and how many people would help bring that about? And we do need to think about what's realistic these days. I'm not seeing a lot of 15 to 20 member boards that are having all the seats filled. They're carrying a lot of empty seats. And I'd rather you carry an empty seat, or 2 or 3, than fill it with someone who really isn't committed or interested or isn't going to be attending. But maybe if that happens year after year, without taking away from the democracy and the engagement in your organization, maybe having less members can make some sense. And I know it's a slippery slope because we're having trouble often filling the boards of directors. And I'm seeing it particularly as we're getting into this phase of COVID. Just general engagement, I might be wrong. What I see is it's down. We're all a little tapped out. And so be careful we don't lower quickly the numbers on our board when maybe we'll be able to regain it. But if consistently we've been having trouble filling those spots, and if we still can get good representation, maybe we can lower those numbers a little bit. And that's a really good board discussion to have.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question that just popped in, and it's actually a really, really great question. So someone said, I sit on different boards, but also on councils and committees. Are the policies and procedures the same for all 3?
Okay, so if it's all within the same, it's policies and procedures are in an organization. So I'm sitting on the board of directors, I'm sitting on the committee of that organization, and I'm sitting on a council of that organization. And those policies and procedures should go across that organization. They don't always take everything into account. So sometimes policies and procedures get written thinking mostly about staff, and we need to adjust it and think about the volunteers, and particularly the board, the policy volunteers, the board volunteers. In different organizations, I'm on a council over here, I'm on a board of directors here, I'm on a committee that's probably, because we can talk about committees more, part of this board of directors. The council is something different. They have different policies and procedures. That's internal governance. That's not government rules. That government rules have an impact on policy. You got to follow the law, but you decide the details of it much more than at the board of directors level.
So cross-pollination, I guess, is important.
Well, it goes across the organization. Yeah. So if we have a harassment policy, that harassment policy is for, sorry, something just popped up here. If we have a harassment policy, that policy goes across the organization, because can you imagine if it didn't? We deal with harassment one way here, but in a different way here. Doesn't make sense. Communications, who speaks on behalf of the organization? It's across the organization. Everybody needs to know it. Travel expenses, everybody needs to know it.
Great, thanks, Francis. I'll pass the puck to Ruth.
Thank you. Those were very interesting questions. And now we're going into presentation 3. And following that, Francis will go directly into the review of the handout package. And we're going to hear about liability insurance and holding effective board meetings. Oh boy, we can all learn that one. And conflict resolution. So Francis, I'm turning it right back to you.
Thank you, Ruth. And, you know, I actually realized under roles and responsibilities, I wanted to talk about the relationship with staff. So I'm gonna throw that under other key items because I think it's important. And we're going to start with that one. And at this point, I would say, if you have other questions that you're wondering about, like, now is a good time to get them into the chat line so that we can start thinking about focusing the discussion more on what you want to talk about rather than what I think we should be talking about. So let me just talk a little bit about board fundamentals. An underlying theme for me in this presentation is, as we're cooking together this recipe through the board, it's about teamwork. We're doing it together. And so we need to be working together. We need to be developing as a group together. It's not just work, it's also the process of how we work that we need to be considering. So some things to think about are the idea of, for example, wearing the hat of a board member, not as a program participant or a volunteer, or actually, you know, as a unpaid staff person if we're in an organization that doesn't have any staff. When we're at the board level, we're thinking broad governance of the organization. And I know we know this, but we need to be reminded. We're not thinking about my mother and her needs from this organization. We're not thinking about what I would like to see in terms of the details of changing the timing of that program 15 minutes. That's a staff level thing. We take that to the staff. The board is the broad level. And that can be a really hard switch for us to make. I've worked with boards in the past, haven't done it recently. Darlene Gargle, if any of you remember her from years ago, she and I used to go around with a box of hats. And we would literally say to people, put on the board hat. No, you just took off the board hat. You're putting on your program hat, but think about the hat that you're wearing. And then a second one, making decisions around the table. When a bunch of us know each other, I'm working with an organization now where a lot of the people know each other. It's really to get easy to get into informal chatting and kind of come to a conclusion together that hasn't involved the entire board. And so it's important to really bring those discussions to the table, bring everyone in. We do want to hear different voices. We also want to, as you see in the cartoon, we want to speak in one voice. And this guy is suggesting that they use Donald Duck. I'm suggesting that you use the board voice of, this is the decision we've come to. Even if it's been a little bit conflictual or difficult to come to it, once we've come to it and we've voted on it with whatever voting system is in our bylaws, or if not in our board manual, do we follow consensus decision making? Is it 50% plus 1? Is it 70%? We need to be really clear about how we make decisions, but we make those decisions around the table and we honor those decisions. And that's what we share as a board. So we don't say, we decided to not go after this funding, and I really disagree with that. That's around the board table. But in public, it's like, no, it was a board decision. It was a really difficult decision, but it was a board decision that at this point, we're not going after this funding. And that's where we leave. So we honor those decisions that are made. And that's why, and I know many of you don't work with consensus decision making, but consensus decision making takes longer, but it gets us to the point where people can come around the decision. When it's 50% plus 1, when I'm the president and I have a vote that means that it's barely passed, 55–60% of my board agree or disagree, I don't feel I have a good decision. I think we need to work this a little bit more. We need to talk about it more. Maybe we need to get more data. We need to come back to it in some way, because that's not coming together and having good teamwork. We have to try to, and we can't always, but we have to try to get it to a point where there's a stronger sense from the board coming together around that decision. And then the last one, respect board discussion, confidentiality. So yeah, we've talked about it. We don't need to go into, and you'll see in the handouts, I think I put something in there, I'll double check. Board minutes, board minutes don't need to say, Joe said this and Sue thought he was crazy, but Sam thought it was a great idea because his sister-in-law did that once. We don't need those kind of details. We just need the basic, here's the kind of discussion we had. Concern about this. Here are some of the positive things about making this decision, and clarity about the decision the board made. And if we have to go to vote, then it's actually saying what the vote was, not who voted, not who said yes and who said no, but it passed 8-2 or whatever it was. So that's a little bit about some board fundamentals that I just love to have you consider in terms of the boards that you're involved in. And if anyone wants to call me up and try out their Donald Duck board voice with me, I would be happy to tell you if you've been successful with that one. And then just quickly, staff and board roles. So just the difference, and every organization, this recipe we're making with the board, every organization is a little bit different. And so you need to find that gray area between board responsibilities and decision-making and staff responsibilities, because there is no absolute black line. We need to try and get it in the organization. So staff are key drivers of the activities. They implement what the organization needs to be doing. They keep the organization running. The board generally provides oversight. And I don't know if that's too broad, but that's the guidelines I go back to when I'm confused. I say, is this really oversight, or now am I meddling? And if I'm not sure, I ask, hey, am I going too deep when I want to talk about this, or does this make sense? Is it the board's decision, or is that really staff decision? And I know that can be a little bit uncomfortable, but it can help get more clarity for that organization of the gray zone. And this has come up if we don't have staff. Sometimes the board needs to assist with day-to-day activities. And sometimes the board has to make decisions at an operational level. I know one organization, I just found out the ED literally left on a Friday, and on the Monday there was a grant that was due, and the board, of course, had to step in. They had approved it, that it wasn't due. There were some details that were missing. The board had approved the grant request. The board had to step in and help the other staff. So suddenly there's no ED there. There's no ED there for a little while, but we try to get clarity. And can we assign board members to take some of those responsibilities? I do see there's a hand raised, and I'm just, I think, Katie, we'll catch it at the end, right?
Yeah, I just asked the person to just write the question down in the chat, and we'll get to it at the end. Absolutely.
All right, so staff and board roles. So, and I'm just going to talk briefly about these, and then take whatever questions people have before we move to the handout. So, liability insurance. That's one thing that unfortunately all organizations need it now. I'm going to say thanks to the influence of our American counterparts, where people were getting sued more and more often, and we did have some problems in Canada with not-for-profits getting sued. It's important that the board has liability insurance. That doesn't take away your responsibility to work with a good mind, to make sure you have information, to attend board meetings to the best of your knowledge, get information, to seek legal counsel if it's needed. You do have that responsibility, but having liability insurance helps cover you as an individual. And I don't want to go into that too much, because I'm going to leave it to my friends at Edgepadois who really know that stuff well, but it's important to think about it. And most recent boards I've been on, we've actually put that in the board kit that people get so that they can see a copy or a link if it's on a Google Drive. We provide a link. Holding effective board meetings. I mean, we could do a whole session on this, right? So what are some of the key things that I think about? One are, that we have an agenda that's thought out ahead of time, and there's considerations around how much time each agenda item needs. And I think effective board meetings includes having clarity about, is this item coming to the board for a decision, for a discussion, or is information? Because I've seen lots of boards where something comes as information, big event that we've got going on, and suddenly it seems to be into some kind of decision making or changing things. And it's like, no, this is a program question. The grant was approved, the staff is implementing it. It's got to go down to the program level and not have the board involved in it, but the board needs to know about it, what's going on. So those are some considerations. How long are our board meetings? Do we try to make it a little bit equal for who gets to talk? One tool that I use often in meetings is, if you've already spoken once, can you wait till 2 other people speak before you jump in again? And if you haven't spoken at all, can you make sure that you speak at least twice during the meeting? And I know that's really hard for people at both ends of that spectrum to do, but we want to get engagement. The other way we can do it is do a quick tour of the table, or asking, who have we not heard from? I'd love to hear from who we have not heard from, so that we get those voices that aren't speaking up a little bit more. So those are some things around effective board meetings. Getting documents out early. As a board member, that we actually read the documents ahead of time, so we're saving time when we get to the board meeting with having to reread them. That we're sitting on top of those dossiers enough, so if we're really not understanding it, which is perfectly normal, we give a quick call to the ED or to another board member to try and get clarity about what's going on, so that we come to the board meeting prepared. Respecting the timing of agenda items. And I'm sure you guys have a list of all kinds of other things. If you want to throw them in the chat line, we need to feed each other on how we can run effective board meetings. Because if I'm constantly going to a board that's boring, I'm not going to want to keep going. I need to feel there's something good happening. And hey, one idea for me, this is important because I like eating. Teamwork, effective board meetings. If it's around a meal time, and if we can afford it, bringing in food is really nice, and having a little bit of socializing time. At Cocoa at one point, we didn't have much money. We did buy a crock pot, and a staff person bought stuff to throw in a crock pot at noon, and there was something to eat when people came, or at least coffee and tea and water and some little snack, just to create that sense of coming together. Harder when we're working by Zoom, I know. I certainly know organizations that have said we normally have money for refreshments. And so every board member is going to get, a $5 thing. And it'd be lovely to hear what you bought with your $5 for the board meeting from 1 or 2 of you. And people hold up their little piece of cheesecake or hold up their fancy coffee that they got. Anyway, throw more ideas into the chat that you can see other ideas for holding effective board meetings. The last one I'll talk about, and then we can get some more questions going. The board's role in HR. So human resources, what is the board supposed to do? And we need to have clarity around this. What does it say in terms of your bylaws for hiring and terminating the executive director, which is often in there, that's the role of the board. And if it doesn't say that the board hires and terminates other employees, then they don't. Then it goes into the staff structure, and it's the executive director that does it. Or within the HR policy, it becomes clear Maybe it's the HR, the ED and a manager that does it in conjunction, but there needs to be some clarity. Hiring is one thing. Some organizations say we bring the recommended person to the HR committee, if there is one. I've rarely seen that we actually bring it to the board, unless it's, of course, for the ED. But what do we do in the case of termination? Because terminating an employee is a really difficult process. And ideally, the board should stand behind that. And yet the challenge is, I don't need to know as a board member the dirty laundry of what went on with that employee. That does not need to be super public. Just a small group of people need to know that. But in some organizations, the termination is actually managed through a bit of an HR committee. So it might be whoever manages HR in the organization and maybe one board member. Maybe the committee has an HR specialist from the outside on it, or maybe it's a second board member. And the idea that they bring a recommendation, and the recommendation that they bring to the board for termination is not super, super detailed, but that we have enough trust in that committee with the decision they're making so that we can stand behind the decision. And I say that knowing it's like a super complex, difficult process. We often follow the legal requirements and we want to make sure that legally we're okay. But I also think we need to make sure that the organization can stand behind that decision, not just from a legal perspective, but also from a moral perspective. So I think I'll stop. Oh, sorry, I'm not going to stop sharing. No, actually, I'll go back to the last slide later. Yeah, let's take it to questions, comments, and then I'll go back to the last slide, and then we'll do the handout package.
So yeah, there were a few questions. So the first one has to do with consensus decision making. So the question is essentially, oftentimes, board members can just get stuck in discussions and trying to find a solution and debating and all that. So how does consensus decision making ensure, sorry, there's a fly, ensure that a decision is actually made, and what processes ensure that people don't go away unhappy and disengaged?
Yeah, so the idea behind consensus decision making is that we don't go away unhappy versus voting. And so there's a bunch of tools that you can find online that can help you with this. But the idea of saying, let's make sure all voices are heard and keep the discussion going, being open to hearing differences of opinion until we can come to enough of a shared understanding, and this is really important, that we can all live with. I may not love it, but I can live with it. I couldn't live with the decision when we first started talking, but now we've talked about it and we've maybe adjusted it a little bit, or people have helped me understand it more, or my fears about it have been waylaid a little bit. And I'm ready to say that I'm willing to live with it. And I know it's really hard to do consensus decision making. A lot of nonprofits have a percentage, so a voting, it's 50% plus one, or 60% or 70 or whatever. Some of them that I've seen have a nice little process which says, and you may not agree with this, but we're going to try to do consensus decision making first. And if it really doesn't work, then we're going to go to a vote. And I personally find that for a lot of organizations that aren't used to consensus decision making, that can work quite well. So let's talk about it. We're going to keep going. We're going to try it some more. It's not fully working. We do have to make a decision. So now we're going to go to a vote. And then for me, the key thing would be, let's be a learning organization. Can we debrief that process? And what did we learn about making decisions together and listening to each other and all of that as we did it?
Okay, and it's another question related to effective meetings, board meetings. Can anyone ask to hear from someone else, or is it only the chair that can do that?
Oh, I really hope that the culture of the organization is open enough that people can ask to hear from other people. You know, I'd love to hear your perspective on this, Suzanne, right? It's like, some people really get into Robert's rules, and, you know, the chair can decide who talks and who talks when. There's something called Roberta's rules, which is a lot more easygoing and a lot more, you know, let's let some discussion flow. And the role of the chairperson is to help bring it together, but let the discussion happen and then try to bring it together and see, and maybe even put out a proposal. Sounds to me like most of us are saying, this is what needs to happen. Let's hear a few comments and then we'll vote on it, or whatever our next step is around it. So I really hope at your board, people are encouraged to talk. And if they're not, if it's only the chair who allows people to talk, maybe there's a little bit of a board evaluation process that can happen about how can we make this board, it sounds like it needs to be more engaging, and how can we make it more engaging for everyone.
Okay, so in the spirit of Roberta's rules, someone asked the question of any ideas on how to renew or refresh ways of taking minutes in a less formal way.
Well, I don't know what the formal, the formal way, I guess, would be Robert's rules, right? We have a motioner, we have a seconder, I don't even remember Robert's rules. Like, you know, I have a counter proposal or something like that. It gets pretty complicated, right? I would suggest, and I think there's something in the handout package, that a nice way to take minutes is to have real clarity about what is the decision or information or discussion that needs to happen. What were the absolute key points that are made, and that the final line or two is the summary of that. And some people go even shorter than that. I realize that it's literally, you know, decision made to do this and do that. Information on the annual fundraiser was given, point. And that's all that's in the minutes. And certainly for efficiency's sake, that's super helpful. One of the things that I find helpful in minutes, I must say, is when there's a to-do list, when people have made commitments for follow-up, that either their name gets bolded in the minutes, or if you really have the time, creating a second little list of our follow-up items. And it literally says, you know, Francis will follow up with this or that. And then I go, oops, right? I'm supposed to do something. And I might do it before the next board meeting, because that can be a problem, right? People don't get stuff done, and then it takes time. It comes to the next board meeting and it hasn't been completed. So a to-do list, and then the other thing comes to the next board meeting, hasn't been completed, goes to the third board meeting, hasn't been completed, goes to the fourth board meeting, hasn't been completed. At what point do we as a team member say, hey, it looks like it's not working for you? Maybe you don't have the time. Maybe we should be doing it differently. Maybe somebody else should be doing this. Because that's a problem we often get into with boards, that we just don't quite lovingly confront people.
Okay, so the next question, which is a good question actually, how to ensure that a board has the experience to supervise staff when, you know, the reality is that perhaps many boards don't have that experience. So how do you go about that?
Yeah, how do you go about that? So, hey, maybe that's a board requirement. Maybe we need a board member who actually has done a little bit of supervision and knows something about it. Maybe we need to get a little training session on it. Maybe we need to hire someone who can help us with that, to figure it out a little bit more, because we do come onto the board not necessarily with all of those skills. Maybe we can be honest with the executive director. I'm new at this, and I'm not very good at this, so I'm also learning. So let's learn together how I can support you. That's when it's working well. We can do that.
Okay, and there's a couple of other questions about procedures. So I'll I'll send them to you one by one. So the first one is the importance of maintaining a minute book, and for how many years do you keep them? So I know, you know, there's legally you have to keep your financial documents for X number of years. Does the same apply to minutes?
I have no idea, but please keep your minutes all in one place. And if it's virtual, have a backup, and it should be virtual, even if it's also a binder. And I loved it when we started at Coco. I actually numbered each minutes of the meetings. So year 1, minute 1, year 12, minutes 9. And I think that's a really nice idea to do that. But yes, you have to keep the minutes of the meetings, and certainly your AGM minutes, don't lose them. People lose them from one year to the next, and they're trying to reconstruct them 11 months after the AGM happened. Get those minutes, get them back to the board so they can see them, and get them filed so you'll have them next year.
Okay. And then the other procedure question is, do you necessarily always need a seconder in board meetings? Because the person writes, many boards only do proposers. I think that's a new term. I like that, proposers.
So what does it say? I'm going to go back to the bowls. What does it say in your bylaws about how you make decisions? Does it say that you need a seconder? If it doesn't, you don't necessarily. And then what's your policy on decision making? And if you don't have a policy, what's your procedure? And if it's not written down, this is how we make decisions. So we're fine with people making a proposal, and then we you know, we put up hands, or sometimes it's just anybody got a problem with that, is the way we go at it. The challenge, I think, is when new board members come in and they've come from an organization that follows Robert's rules. And there you are saying, let's propose, you know, I'm going to propose. And so that's why some kind of orientation and board manual is helpful, because it talks about the culture, the way we do things around here. So this is the way we tend to make decisions. And as soon as you have that discussion and start to write it down, it actually often raises really interesting questions, because people say, oh, is that how we make decisions? I thought, you know, so getting clarity helps.
Okay, and right at the top when we came back from the break, someone asked this question is, what is the role of the ED? So I'm just going to stretch it out a little bit. So for example, what is the difference between the role of the ED and the president of the board?
The ED is responsible for running the organization. Decisions are made. We've got grants. We've got our strategic plan. The ED and the staff team are there to implement. Doesn't mean the board doesn't implement anything. I know the board sometimes takes responsibilities for perhaps some fundraising or some external relations or some government relations, but the ED holds the overall responsibility to implement what has been decided the organization is going to be doing. And I'm sorry I can't be more clear than that, but that's a little bit sometimes that gray zone. So if someone has an example of a very specific one of, is that the board or is that the ED, we could look at that, but often it's having a little bit that discussion, because hands-on boards tend to do a bit more. Pure governance boards tend to do a lot less. And the challenge, I think, is the boards that are shifting from having no staff to having staff and then having an ED. We really have to have those conversations, because as boards, we're used to doing so much.
Right, no, that's a pretty important point. Thanks for that, Francis. And I'm just going to throw one more question out there. Someone was talking at one point about the importance of terminology. So it got me thinking, terminology is important when you're writing policies and procedures. So for example, if anyone wants to check the difference between a mandate or a goal or a vision, where could they find that terminology? Are there any resources? I'm putting you on the spot, but there you go.
No, that's a really good question. So I deal with this when I'm teaching all the time, right? Because for me, it's like really, really clear. A goal is broad, it's longer term. An objective is concrete, it's smart, simple, measurable, attainable, realistic time, right? You know, and a mandate is something that sort of sits at the side of goals, and it's an area that we need to work on. It's a responsibility that we have. But my interpretation isn't the same as other people's necessarily. And so when I'm working with an organization, one of the things I often first do is I say, so this is my understanding of a goal and an objective and a mandate. And is this what we're working with? And I've recently worked with an organization, drives me crazy. They have objectives that are 3 years long. To me, that's not an objective. For them, that's an objective. And then they have actions. And so they're working, so there's something called the ladder of decision making. They're working the ladder differently than I do. Let's talk about it and clarify. And as the outside facilitator, it's their organization. It's the way they word the stuff. But let's get clarity in the organization.
Great, thanks for that. So I guess I'm going to pass it back to Ruth.
Well, just thank you very much. The questions were great. And I just want to keep us on time because I know everybody's busy. We're now going to go to the final segment, which is the review of the handout packages. Now, most of you should have received it. I've received messages from 2 individuals who did not. I don't know what happened. But anyway, Francis, turning it right back to you to go over the handout. And are we going to have any time at all in the 30 minutes for people to put questions in? And,
Oh, lots.
Okay, so get your questions in the chat box so Katia can ask Francis the questions as she wraps up the review of the handbook. It's
And
all yours.
I just want to say I'm not following the chat box in detail because my brain just can't quite handle that.
No,
And
Katia is doing
yeah.
it. So they're putting it in for everybody.
Yeah.
So we see, we don't duplicate questions and
Yeah.
Katia pulls them up.
I'm,
So when
I'm,
you're
I'm
ready for
scribbling away.
questions, when you're ready for questions, just give us,
Yeah.
30 seconds.
But what I do really like with the bits I've seen is that people are putting up good practice that you're using in your organizations, and lots of tips and stuff. And I think that's one of the disadvantages of a webinar format is that it's hard for us to share our good practice. Like you're just hearing mine. And so I really like hearing that on the chat line. So thanks for doing that.
Well, maybe we can do a face-to-face conference at some point.
Imagine that.
Pending funding.
Yes. Okay. So I am just going to share my screen again because I do want to go. I'm just going to go to my last slide now, and then we'll talk a bit about the handouts. We talked a bit about the legal requirements, the BOLs, and at what level it's with the government and what level it's internal. We talked about the journey that a board member goes through. We've talked about roles and responsibilities, and then we've hit on a couple of other little pieces that get connected to that. And I would just love to have you think and maybe even write something down about what at this point are the key ingredients for your board to be successful. Like what is in place right now that you really need to hang on to? And it could be really good use of the documentation. It could be, functioning really well. People can ask questions comfortably. Or what are the key ingredients for your board to be successful that are maybe missing as you create this board of directors? Maybe some ingredients that you want to take away from this session and add. So just think about that for a minute and write a note or two about successful or needed ingredients.
they're coming in.
Oh, are people writing them in the chat?
Yes, they are. They
Oh,
are. Yeah,
cool.
they are. Yeah. So, do you want me to wait a little bit more, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I would love to hear some of them. Let's hear a bunch before we go
Okay,
to the
so
handouts. Yeah.
the first one, the first six that, woo, they're coming in now. The first, the first one is good faith. And then the second one is open discussion. Oh, they're coming in. Hold on. The third one is respect everyone's opinion and to summarize afterwards what was discussed before the vote. The next one is follow your bylaws. And then genuine belief in the mission. Let me turn my camera on. I just realized it's off. We need to do the concept of a manual. So I guess having a board manual is another good ingredient. And that's it so far.
All right.
Good suggestions though, for sure.
So I'm actually really pleased to hear that a bunch of the first ones were around what I would call, being a prof in applied human sciences at Concordia, would be called good group process. Coming together, people being engaged, because I was feeling I sort of hadn't emphasized that enough. And there's lots of literature that says, unless you have a good process, you can't work on the content. You can't achieve things unless we have, with the people we're working with, a good sense of trust, a good sense of working together. And so working with the board to build that sense of, we are in this together, we understand the mission together, we have a purpose here, makes it easier to then get on with the work that needs to happen. So
yeah, and a couple of more came in. So holding annual board orientations, then flexibility and openness to envision and adapt changes.
Oh, what's that last one?
Flexibility and openness to envision and adapt changes.
Yeah, adapting. Oh boy, did COVID teach us a lot about that, huh?
Or otherwise known as pivoting.
Pivoting, yeah. And that's been a challenge for a lot of board. We couldn't get together easily. We all had to learn Zoom at first, or many of us did. And stuff was happening so fast. Staff were having to move really quickly. I really wonder how many organizations are finding some time to debrief how that pivot happened and what have we learned from it, and what good came from it in terms of different ways of working, and where did we maybe drop the ball a little bit. I think that's an interesting reflection if we want to be kind of a learning organization.
Yeah, and someone else echoed that. They said, we lost a lot since many organizations are not meeting face-to-face. Meetings are since we're not meeting face-to-face meetings, so harder to maintain that team spirit.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's what we realized in lots of places, right? We lost that with Zoom. And so I'm also hearing there's better attendance at my board meetings because it's easier to pop in by Zoom. With boards, do we do what we're doing a lot with our staff? Do we try to use a bit of a hybrid model? Because we do need that coming together. I'm working with an organization now where we're going into some strat planning review work, and it's like, this is the time to get together. The more management stuff we'll keep doing on Zoom, but we're going to try and have a meeting so that we can actually talk about how those strategic directions are going and what we need to do in the next year. So good stuff to think about. Okay, so I am going to, and I don't know how well this is going to work, folks. I am going to pull up the handout package. And I am not going to walk you through a handout package. I would not force anyone to go through that at the end of a training session. But what do I want to point you to? I mean, I've put in some of the documents. They're representative of the slides. And so just so that you would have that, I talk a bit more about the roles in detail. I already referred you to that. I think I do want to spend a little bit of time on this page, which is page 4, just legal responsibilities. So the idea, and I'll just underline a few things here, and you can look at it at your own leisure. If you want it to fall asleep at night, this might be a good paper to read to do that too. The idea of acting in the best interest of the organization as a whole instead of your interest. I talked about it a little bit with the fundamentals of a board of directors, but for me, that's a really interesting one to come back to regularly, thinking and actually saying out loud, what's best for the organization? What do we need to do for the organization? Is just kind of a mindfulness that helps ground me a little bit. I'm also now going down here. For liability insurance, I talked about the fact that you need to do the best job you can, but because you don't want to be held liable, but it is the liability insurance covers you, but you do have to have competence. And if you don't have that competence, because you're not expected to be experts on everything, you can go and hire that competence. So, whether it's from or get, volunteer, whether it's a lawyer, an accountant, someone in HR to help you with it. So we don't have to be experts, but we do have to try and get the expertise, whether it's through us or through someone else. And then the other one I wanted to highlight here was avoiding conflicts of interests and declare them when they arise. Some of the organizations more in the rural areas, it's hard not to hire family members. It's hard not to have, on the board of directors and on the staff, all kinds of family relations. We know you're not involved in the hiring if it's for someone who's related to you. If it's your company that's involved in something, making a proposal or something to do some work on the building or whatever, we need to note that. And if there's a conflict, we step back. We step back and we don't get involved. My husband is a documentary filmmaker, and he does a lot of work with nonprofits. And my line always was, when I was super active with a lot of groups, was, you can have Glenn do something for you, but you can't pay him, because I just don't want it, if he agrees, because I just don't want it to get into that. It just gets a little complicated when I'm involved here on the board and it's my husband you want to do something with. Sometimes people really need the money, and so there is a contract, but then you got to be really clear, you got to pull back, you got to state it. And I know we know this stuff, but I just kind of want to remind people. And this one I think is important to highlight. The board must ensure that members' rights are respected. Members have to be invited to your AGM, and they have to have proper notice. And it says it in the bylaws, usually, what the notice is. It used to say 30 days by mail. It now often says 14 days by, and it lists, it can be, mail or email, but they really have to be notified. And at the AGM, they are updated on activities. They don't have to vote on them. They have to be updated on activities. They have to elect new board members. They have to vote on changes to the bylaw. They have to approve it or not. And they receive a copy of the organization's financial statements. So they're not voting on everything. Some things they are receiving as members, but some things they're voting on. And the book, Votre Association, which is listed in my reference list at the back, does go into that into more detail. And they're invited if there's any special general meetings. And it says here that are made to change things to the organizational's charter, to the organizational's objectives. But, there's often a provision in bylaws for members being able to call a special meeting. If there's extreme discord in the organization, that it takes X number of members and they can call a special meeting, and the chair has to run that meeting. But that's in your bylaws. So you got to look and see what's in your bylaws around special meetings. Not going to talk about this a lot, but if the organization has charitable status, you have another whole set of government requirements, and you better make sure that you're meeting them, because that's fundamentally important. And that's another whole session. So board fundamentals we talked about. Staff and board roles, I go into it a little bit more, so you might want to look at this handout, which is on page 6 and 7. Some resources around what a job description might look like. Board members' job descriptions is not a bad idea. It helps clarify what's needed. And then there was a few questions about how to run board meetings. And so there is a handout in here starting on page 7 around some basics for developing an agenda. There is something about taking minutes. Someone had a question about that. A format. It's one format. There's other formats out there. It's one I kind of like. I'll tell you, anything that you put time as we did with this session, I always leave a little bit of bumper time on each side. So it says approval of minutes 7 to 7:10. I know it's only going to take 5 minutes. I got bumper 5 minutes because I know we're going to be late in getting started. And then we've got, minutes, the way that we do them. So I'll leave that with you. Board committees we haven't talked about, but many boards of directors do mandate committees to take on certain responsibilities, whether it's HR, finances, fundraising, might be a program committee. Most important, I'll leave this for you to read, but I think the most important is a really clear mandate from the board. Is it a decision-making committee? Is it a reporting committee? What is the scope of what they're looking at? And who's supposed to be members of it? Is it having members who are only on the board of directors, or is it having members who are also on the committee who are members of the organization or external people? So getting clear about the mandate really, really helps. That I'll leave with you. Policies we talked about, so I'm glad I put this in here, just about developing policy. And then I did put a list of policies we often see. So you can look at that. And I did put an example of board evaluation process. I mean, there's many on the internet, and you've got to build it based on what it is you want to look at, but that's an example. And conflict of interest, and some more details around how to look at conflict of interest. I hope I'm not making you dizzy with this. And then the last page is just the resources. And there you see the third one is votre association, the government resources. Google isn't the answer to everything, but certainly Googling some things and seeing if it resonates with what you think. Going to Coco's website, I think I put Coco's website in there. If it's around volunteering, going to Volunteer Canada's website. There's different places that we can go to check out information that we need to put in into our documents. I'm sorry, I'm losing it. My grandson's standing at the door talking to me. Hi, Zabby. Sorry. All right, so that's it for the handout, folks. I'm wondering what last comments or questions that leaves people with.
So there are actually 2 questions, but before we got into the handouts, do you want me to shoot them your way?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the first question is about vetting new board members. Do you have any suggestions on the best way to go about that? And is it maybe, inviting them to attend board meetings or informal meetings? So what's the best way to get new board members?
Yeah, to vet them. I think that's a really good question. And other people might want to throw your ideas into the chat line. I think it's having a paragraph or 2 that's being written about what it is you're looking for in board members. And somebody from the board sits down and shares that with the person and talks about what their skills and interest might be. And I'm not sure I would invite them to a board meeting, but some organizations do. But having them come to maybe an event or something that's happening, or to drop by, if that works, is always a good idea. I mean, ideally, board members come from people who are engaged with the organization already. So I'm a partner organization and I know you through the work we do. I attend one of your activities already, but I know that doesn't always happen. And so having a little bit of clarity and getting clarity from both the potential new board member who may not get voted in, right? Like, you've got to be clear with them also. It's a voting process, and if not enough people are running, they'll get in, but if a bunch of people are running, they may not get in. So that one's a really tough one, I find, saying, sorry, you didn't get elected. Yeah, so that's a good process to go through. And it can often be through, that sort of a nominations committee that prepares for the annual general meeting.
Okay, and then there's another question about AGMs. Does the membership vote on the specific board positions that are available, or is that something that the board should decide in a separate board meeting?
What does it say in your bylaws? We're back to looking at the bowls that hold us, legally responsible. Most organizations do not elect the executive positions at the board. The board, they elect all the board members. The board goes off and the board decides that. I do know of some bylaws that say the chair of the board is voted at the AGM. I'm never sure that that's great, but it seems to work for a number of organizations.
I'm sorry, I love hearing the little person in the background. It's nice. That's it. I'm not seeing any other questions coming in. Unless people have any other questions, I think we're good question-wise.
Well, I think then we can call it a day. And Francis, you're exceptional, not only with your expertise, but your timing. It's unbelievable. So I thank everybody for sticking it out and staying with us. I'm sure you have benefited from all the information that Francis gave to us. It's an ever-learning curve when you're working with nonprofits. Everyone is different and they have different mandates and missions, but you can benefit by being an active volunteer big time. So I encourage you to get involved and stay involved. To wrap it up, Katia, I thank you for being our technical expert and managing all the questions. Francis, I can't say thank you enough. It's been tremendous. It was great spending the morning with you, and we'll have to do it more often.
My pleasure, Ruth.
And so I wish everybody a great day. Enjoy the nice warmer weather. And I just found out today, in case you didn't know, because I heard nothing about it, we changed the clocks. I think it's November the 6th, so it's not this weekend. So have a great day, everybody, and we'll say goodbye, and you'll watch for your recording, which should be coming in 2-3 days.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you. This was absolutely wonderful.
Good.
Thank you, Francis.
You're welcome.
Good.
Bye, everybody. You can show
Bye.
your
Thank you
face
very much.
now. We
This
can
is
say
the half
goodbye
time,
to
right?
you all.
Thank you very
Bye.
much. Cynthia, show your face.
Bye.
Have a great week.